Ever feel like you're juggling like a million thoughts at once?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Like your brain's about to drop everything?
Yeah, I know that feeling.
What if I told you some of those thoughts, yeah, they might not actually be like actively up there.
Intrigued.
Maybe they're tucked away somewhere.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
That's what we're diving into today, how attention and working memory, well, they're not quite what we think.
That juggling analogy, that's pretty much how we used to think working memory worked. Everything's lit up on stage all the time.
Right, right.
But a couple of studies, one from 2019, it was in Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews, and another back in 2009 from Trends in Cognitive Sciences. They paint a different picture, like way more nuanced.
So not everything's on all the time.
Right. And that has some like really wild implications for how we learn and process, well, everything, really.
So instead of a brightly lit stage, what are we talking about?
More like backstage, where some memories are kind of hanging out in the shadows.
Okay, love that. So what's going on back there?
Well, the 2019 study, they talk about this idea of activity silent memory. It means instead of neurons constantly firing, some memories, they're stored in the connections between neurons.
Okay, wait, back up a sec. Those connections, that's like synapses, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But how do synapses hold memory if they're not like actively firing?
It's about synaptic weights. Think of it like every time you learn something, the path between certain neurons, it gets stronger.
Ah, okay.
Like carving a trail through the woods. The more you walk it, the clearer it gets. So these like strengthened pathways, those are the physical traces of memory.
So it's not like neurons shouting, remember this. It's more like they've left a trail of breadcrumbs.
Yeah, perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And these like breadcrumbs, these changes in synaptic weights, they can hold tons of information, but it's like dormant, ready to go when needed.
But how do we find those breadcrumbs again? Do we like have to rummage through our brains?
This is where attention comes in. The 2019 study, they suggest it's what we pay attention to that brings those dormant memories back, back into the light.
So it's like a spotlight. Whatever's under the beam, that's what we're actively thinking about.
Exactly. And everything else is, like you said, waiting in the wings.
Okay, makes sense. But wait, if we can only focus on one thing at a time, how do we manage to like hold multiple thoughts or, do multiple tasks?
That's the cool part about this activity silence system, right? We can keep way more in reserve than if everything had to be on all the time.
So it's a trade-off, like less immediate access, but way more storage space.
Exactly.
But doesn't that make us super vulnerable to like distractions? What if something just grabs our attention? Does that spotlight just like swing over there?
That's exactly what happens. And get this, social cues can totally hijack that spotlight too.
Yeah.
We're talking things like, somebody's gaze, and we don't even realize it.
Seriously, someone's side eye can mess with my memory.
That's where that 2009 study comes in. They found a part of the brain, the posterior superior temporal sulcus.
Mm-hmm.
Long name, I know.
Yeah, that's a mouthful.
But anyway, that part of the brain is like hyper aware of where someone's looking. And not just that, but like what they're intending with that look.
Oh, wow. So like if someone stares at me while I'm talking, I might forget what I was saying.
It's possible. Our brains are wired to pay attention to social cues because, way back when, it was crucial for survival. Knowing what someone was looking at, what they were focused on, it could mean life or death.
Okay, so our brains are trying to help, but in today's world, that could backfire.
Yeah, in a way, it's like our brains are running on like Stone Age software, but we're in the 21st century.
Yeah.
So no wonder we feel overwhelmed sometimes.
Totally. But going back to those unattended memories, the ones stored away, are they like safe back there or can they get lost?
Great question. That brings us to this concept of memory interference and decay. That 2019 model, it showed that those unattended memories, the ones in those silent traces, they're more likely to get, messed with.
Messed with? Like how?
Think of it like a path in the woods. If no one walks it, it gets overgrown.
So if we don't like revisit those memories, they fade.
Exactly. And that's why things like repetition, spaced learning, that's so important for making memories last.
Got it. So use it or lose it applies to our memories too. But what about interference from like other stuff? Does that affect things?
Absolutely. Imagine trying to memorize a phone number, but someone keeps like shouting other numbers at you.
Yeah, that would be impossible.
Right. It's same with memories. It's not just time. It's also the sheer amount of information we're bombarded with every day.
So does that mean our memories are like doomed, destined to be overwritten by, like, the internet and everything?
Not necessarily. It is true that our memories are constantly being shaped by new experiences, but we're not, like, totally helpless. The key is to, become more aware of how it all works and then learn how to, work with it.
Okay, so not a static storage system, more like a dynamic, what's a good analogy?
A garden.
A garden, yes. Like a garden that needs tending.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Our memories need to be nurtured,
Yeah.
We got to be mindful of what we're planting in our minds, how we're taking care of those ideas, and how we protect them from, like weeds.
Okay, love that. But how do we actually do that? What are some, like, practical tips for tending to our mental gardens?
First things first, we have to recognize that attention, it's limited.
Right, we can't focus on everything at once.
Exactly. So we got to be choosy about what we let in,
It's like, are you spending your attention on what really matters to you? Or are you letting, like, distractions call the shots?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in the whirlwind, social media, news, all that. But if we're not careful, we end up feeling scattered. And we don't actually remember much of what we, consumed.
I've definitely been there. So what's the antidote?
Mindfulness. It's about becoming more aware of your thoughts and feelings, right here, right now. When you start noticing your attention drifting, you can choose to bring it back to what's important.
Ah, so it's like building that mental muscle. Hey, I see you distraction, but I'm focusing on this muscle.
Yeah, exactly that. And it takes practice, like any other kind of training. The more you do it, the better you get at managing your attention, directing your energy toward what you actually value.
Powerful stuff. Now let's go back to those activity silent memories for a sec. We talked about them fading, getting messed with. Is there anything we can do to make them, I don't know, tougher, less likely to disappear?
Definitely. There are techniques like chunking and elaboration.
Okay, break those down for me.
Sure. Chunking is basically grouping information together. Like, think about phone numbers.
Right, we don't remember all 10 digits separately.
Exactly. We break them into chunks. So instead of trying to memorize a huge list of random facts, you can group them into categories or, connect them in some way that makes sense to you.
So instead of a jumbled mess, we create some order.
Yes.
Yeah.
And elaboration takes it a step further. It's about connecting new information to stuff you already know. Instead of just absorbing it passively, you got to actively engage with it. Ask yourself questions, make connections, maybe even picture it in your mind.
So instead of just data points, it becomes part of your, internal world?
Exactly. The more you can connect it to your existing knowledge and, your life, the stronger those memories become.
Makes sense. It's like weaving those new threads of information into the, the tapestry of your mind.
Perfect analogy.
But what about those times when you really need to remember a lot of information fast? Like for an exam or a presentation? Any tips for those moments?
Absolutely. One of the most effective strategies is spaced repetition.
Spaced repetition.
Yeah. Instead of cramming all at once, you spread out your studying over multiple sessions, and you gradually increase the time between each review.
So instead of force-feeding your brain everything at once, you give it time to digest.
Exactly. And by spacing it out, you're basically forcing your brain to recall the information from those dormant memory traces.
Yeah.
And that, strengthens those connections and makes it more likely to stick.
So it's about working smarter, not harder, when it comes to learning and memory.
Absolutely.
I like that. But I'm also curious, what about those times when we actually want our attention drawn to something? Like if someone's trying to get our attention, or if there's a danger we need to be aware of?
That's a fantastic question. And it gets to the heart of why these social attention mechanisms even evolved. For remember, our brains are constantly trying to figure out what's most important for survival.
Right. So like a sudden movement or someone calling our name, those things grab our attention because our brain's like, hey, this could be important.
Exactly. It's like a built-in alarm system.
Right.
And while it's definitely annoying when it pulls us away from something we're trying to focus on, it's also crucial for keeping us safe.
So it's a balance, right? We need to focus, but also be open to those important cues that might be telling us to shift our attention.
Exactly. And that's why understanding this interplay of attention, memory, and social cues, it's so important.
Right. It's not just about getting things done or remembering our to-do list. It's about understanding how our brains are constantly deciding what to pay attention to and how those decisions, well, they shape how we see the world.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, that's a pretty deep thought to leave our listeners with. But before we wrap things up for this part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about those activity silent memory traces.
Mm.
You mentioned that they're susceptible to interference. Can you break that down a bit more? What kind of interference are we talking about?
Sure. So that 2019 model, it highlighted two main types of interference,
Mm.
decay and disruption. Decay is like the natural fading of those silent traces over time. It's like, that path in the woods getting overgrown.
So if we don't revisit those memories, those connections, those paths, they just like fade away.
Exactly. And that's why, repetition in space learning is so important. By going back to the information, you're essentially clearing that path and keeping it, accessible.
That makes sense. So what about disruption then? How's that different?
Disruption is about interference from other information. Think of it like someone building a new path that intersects with that old one. It makes it harder to follow the original trail. And that's why it's so tough to remember things when we're constantly getting hit with new information.
So if I'm like trying to study for an exam, but I'm also scrolling through social media, those memes and notifications, they're basically creating new paths that are messing with the stuff I'm trying to learn.
You got it.
Ah, that's a good way to visualize it.
And it's another reason why, minimizing distractions is key for learning and remembering things. The less interference you have, the more likely those silent memory traces are to, stay intact.
Okay, so we're battling both time and distraction when it comes to keeping those memory traces. But what about those times when we do need to remember a lot of information, like studying for a big test or giving a presentation?
Well, that's where strategies like chunking and elaboration, they're really come in handy.
Right, right.
Chunking, remember, is about grouping information into smaller pieces. And elaboration is about connecting new information to stuff you already know.
So instead of trying to remember like a zillion random things, we create connections and organize it.
Exactly. It helps to make those memory traces stronger, less likely to get lost in the noise.
So it's not about brute force memorization, but about like working with how our brains actually work.
Exactly. And that's a great takeaway for our listeners today. By understanding how attention and working memory work, we can learn more effectively, remember things longer, and, just navigate this crazy world of information better.
Well said. And that leads us perfectly to the question we'll leave our listeners with as we wrap up this part of our deep dive. If attention is so important and so easily influenced by things around us, how much control do we really have over what we learn and remember? Something to think about.
It's kind of like we're living in a world of, pop-up ads, constantly vying for our attention.
Right.
But we do have some control. It's like installing an ad blocker for our brains.
A mental ad blocker. I like that.
Yeah. It's not about like eliminating all distractions. It's about recognizing which ones are like really hijacking our mental resources and then, taking steps to manage them.
Okay. So how do we install that mental ad blocker? Where do we even begin?
First step. It's simple, but so important. Awareness. Start paying attention to what pulls your attention away. What are your like biggest distractions?
Social media notifications, definitely. And I'm terrible at multitasking. I always think I can get more done, but then...
Oh, yeah, I know that trap. Multitasking. Our brains aren't really wired for it.
Really?
What we call multitasking, it's actually rapid task switching. And every time we switch, it costs us, cognitively.
So it takes time and energy to refocus.
Exactly. We lose efficiency every time we switch.
So my attempt to, like, save time by juggling multiple things, it's actually making me less productive.
It's counterintuitive, right? But it's often true. And this goes back to those activity silent memory traces. Remember, those unattended memories, they're more vulnerable to interference.
Right, right.
So if you're constantly switching between tasks, you're basically like bombarding those memory traces with competing information.
Yeah.
Making them more likely to, decay or get overwritten.
So focusing on one thing at a time, even if it feels slower, could actually help me learn and retain information better.
That's the idea. It lets you, really solidify those memory traces without all the disruption of task switching.
Yeah.
And that's where mindfulness can be a game changer.
Mindfulness.
Yeah. When you practice mindfulness, you're basically training your brain to stay present, to resist that urge, to jump between tasks or get pulled away by every little distraction.
It's like, what was that analogy earlier?
The garden?
Yes. It's like weeding your mental garden so your memories can actually grow.
Exactly. You got to clear out the distractions to make space for what matters.
That makes a lot of sense. But I'm also wondering about, like, the quality of our attention. Even when we are focused on one thing, Are there ways to make that focus more effective?
Absolutely. It's not just about how long we focus, it's about how deeply we engage with the information.
Okay.
And that's where elaboration comes in. Remember, connecting new information to things you already know makes it more meaningful, more memorable.
Right. So instead of passively reading, I could try to relate the concepts to my own life or make mental pictures to help me visualize things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like you're making those memory traces more vibrant. They stand out more,
Yeah, that makes sense. So the more connections I make, the more I actually think about the information, the stronger those memories become.
Exactly. And here's another interesting tidbit from that 2009 study on social cues. Not only can they distract us, they can actually enhance our attention and memory too.
Wait, really? I thought we were trying to block those out.
It depends on the context.
Mm-hmm.
Think about a classroom.
Okay.
When a teacher makes eye contact with a student, it can be a signal that what they're about to say is important.
Mm-hmm.
So the student pays more attention.
So that social cue, the eye contact, it's it's helping the student focus their attention on what matters most.
Exactly. It shows that social cues aren't always bad.
So they can be good or bad depending on how they're used.
Right. It's all about how they're used and how we respond to them.
Okay, that's fascinating. So if I'm giving a presentation, making eye contact with the audience could actually help them remember what I'm saying.
It's worth a try.
I'll have to remember that. And it's not just eye contact, right? It's body language, tone of voice.
Yeah,
All those things can communicate hey, this is important, pay attention.
exactly. They create a sense of engagement, which helps capture and hold our attention.
So it's not just what we're paying attention to, but how we're paying attention.
You got it. Are we passively observing or are we actively engaged?
That's a good distinction. So we might not always be able to control what grabs our attention, but we can control how we react to it.
Exactly. We can choose to, lean in and really engage, or we can let our minds wander.
So even in this world of distractions, we still have some say in how we direct our attention and, I guess, how we experience things.
Exactly. And that's, kind of empowering, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Even though our attention can be a bit flighty, we're not helpless.
Right. We can train it. We
Yeah.
can nurture it. We can use it to create a richer mental life.
I love that. But I'm also thinking about the other side of this. If our attention is so powerful, so influential in how we remember things and experience the world, what does that mean for all the information we're taking in? Are we, more vulnerable to manipulation or misinformation?
That's a really important question. And honestly, it probably deserves its own deep dive.
Yeah.
But it's definitely something to keep in mind, especially these days, With so much information flying around, the more we understand about how our attention works, the better we'll be at, figuring out what's trustworthy, what to let into our minds, and what to, filter out.
It reminds me of that gardening analogy again.
Oh, yeah.
If we're not careful, our minds can become overgrown with weeds,
Mm.
full of misinformation if we don't pay attention to where we're getting our information from.
Exactly. And that's where critical thinking comes in.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We got to question what we see and hear, think about the source, and, be aware of our own biases, too.
So it's not just about paying attention. It's about paying attention critically.
Exactly. It's about being an active participant, not just passively absorbing whatever comes our way. We got to challenge our own assumptions, be open to different perspectives, and be willing to change our minds when new evidence comes along.
That's a tall order in today's world, but it sounds like a worthy goal. And I think you've given us a lot to think about today. We've covered a lot of ground, from those activity silent memories to the attention spotlight and the surprising role of social cues. And we've talked about some practical strategies for, improving our attention and memory.
And ultimately becoming more aware of how our minds work.
Exactly. Which leads us to one final question for our listeners. If our attention is this powerful, this influential in shaping our perceptions and experiences, what are you choosing to focus on today? What information are you letting into your mental space? And how are you using your attention to, create a richer and more meaningful life?
Those are great questions to ponder. And they really get to the heart of what we've been talking about today, the importance of taking control of our attention and using it to shape our own experiences.
Absolutely. And remember, even though our attention might be a little unreliable sometimes, it's also a powerful tool.
The key to unlocking a world of knowledge and understanding.
So keep those mental spotlights shining brightly, folks. And until next time, happy diving. It really does feel like a constant battle for our attention these days. Like one part of our brain is still stuck in, survival mode, scanning for threats.
Yeah, it's like our ancient brain hasn't quite gotten the memo that we're not, running from saber-toothed tigers anymore.
Right. But then there's the rest of us trying to focus on work and life in the 21st century.
It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it? This clash between our ancient wiring and our modern lives. But the more we understand about how our attention works, the better equipped we are to, manage it.
So we're not just helplessly at the mercy of our ancient brains.
Not at all. We have more agency than we think. But it does take effort, like conscious effort, to cultivate those attention skills.
So it's like building mental fitness.
Exactly. Just like physical fitness, it requires practice and consistency. And the more we understand about those underlying mechanisms, the more effectively we can train our minds.
Okay, I like that. It was like instead of beating ourselves up for getting distracted, we can approach it like a workout, strengthening those attention muscles over time.
Exactly. It's about progress, not perfection.
But I'm also thinking about the bigger picture here. Like if our attention is so easily shaped by, all these external things, what does that mean for how we see the world?
That's a great question. And it suggests that our perceptions, even our memories, they're not as objective as we might think.
Right.
They're influenced by where we choose to focus our attention. And in a world that's, overflowing with information, that's a pretty powerful realization.
It's almost like we're creating our own realities based on what we choose to see.
In a way, yes. I mean, think about it. Two people can witness this same event and walk away with totally different memories. It all depends on what caught their eye, what they considered important.
Wow, that's kind of mind-blowing. But it also highlights how crucial it is to be aware of what we're letting into our minds, what we're giving our attention to.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of attentional hygiene comes in. Just like we practice physical hygiene to keep our bodies healthy, we need to practice attentional hygiene to keep our minds healthy.
Attentional hygiene. Okay, I like that. What does that actually look like?
Well, one of the simplest things you can do is, minimize distractions. Turn off those notifications. Create a workspace that's free of clutter. Schedule specific times for checking email and social media.
So it's about setting boundaries.
Exactly. Creating a space that's conducive to focus. And it's also about being mindful of the information we're consuming. Are we surrounding ourselves with things that are uplifting and inspiring? Or are we, constantly exposing ourselves to negativity?
It's so easy to get sucked into, the negativity bias of the news and social media.
It is. But we have to be careful because that negativity can seep into our minds and affect how we feel and how we see the world.
Right. It's like we have a choice, We can actively choose to create a more positive and enriching mental environment for ourselves.
Exactly. It's about taking control of our cognitive experiences.
It's like feeding our minds a healthy diet.
I love that analogy. Just like a healthy diet nourishes our bodies, a healthy information diet nourishes our minds. It gives us the mental building blocks we need to learn and grow.
This has been such a fascinating conversation, and I think it all comes back to the power of attention. It's not just about focusing on one thing at a time. It's about cultivating this mindful, intentional relationship with our own minds, the information we take in, and, the world around us.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And if there's one key takeaway from our deep dive today, it's that you have more control over your attention than you might think.
That's so important to remember.
It's a skill you can develop and strengthen and ultimately use to shape your experiences and, even your reality.
Such a powerful message. It's a great reminder that even in this world of distractions, we still have the power to choose what we focus on, to create a more meaningful and fulfilling life.
Couldn't agree more.
So to our listeners, keep exploring these ideas, keep those mental spotlights shining brightly, and until next time, happy diving.